All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Aaron Norton, and I'm an associate professor here in the Human Sexuality Ph.D. program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Today's event is the second in a year-long celebration that we've put together to honor the milestone of our 10-year anniversary since the founding of our PhD program. And as part of the series, we thought, what better way to mark that milestone than to feature some of the alumni who have graduated from our program and are out in the world doing really amazing things. And thus the title for today's conversation, Transformation in Action, Meet the Sexuality Changemakers of Today. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. But before, I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the format so you know what's to come for the hour and a half that we have together. So Leanne, if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so we'll do the introductions, and then I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask our panelists, and if you have some questions, you can put them in the chat, either to everyone, or you can direct them to me or to Leanne. And unless it's something like real pressing, we're gonna have like 20 to 25 minutes toward the end to open it up to questions from everyone. So we'll do that around 6:30, spend a good 50 minutes with the panelists hearing about their work. And then we'll close out with some closing remarks and tell you a little bit more what's to come in our series. And we'll end right around 7 o'clock. So, all right, without further ado, I'm really happy that each of you could be joining us today to share about what you're up to. But maybe first, if you could each just take a moment to introduce yourselves, your name, where you're calling in from, a little bit about your background, and what you're up to right now. Does anybody want to start us off?
I can jump in. I'm Jacinta. I'm calling in from Spain. I'm at a conference here right now. In the capacity of I'm an assistant professor of social work at Kean University in New Jersey. I also have a private therapy practice in New York City, and yeah, I think that covers it. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much.
So I'll go next. I was trying to let all the ladies go to be a great gentleman. Um, however, so I'm Bernard Davis. I'm calling in from Charlotte, North Carolina, where I reside. Um, and I'm currently the founder and CEO of a community health center, Rail Community Health Center, here in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I've been doing that for the past 7 years.
Yeah, go. Okay. I am Dr. Estefania Simic Munoz. I am originally from Peru, and I currently live in Baltimore, Susquehanna, and Piscataway land. I am an ASEC certified sex therapist, supervisor. I'm an instructor for various sex therapy programs, and I have a private practice, and I'm currently working on building a holistic center for sexual healing. That is what I'm currently doing.
Cool. Great. Dr. Lewis.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Andrea Lewis. I am an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in the Public Health Education Department. I also am a physician assistant as well in the Guilford County Health Department STI clinic. And I'm calling in from Greensboro, North Carolina, so not too far from you, Bernard. And yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with all of you, esteemed colleagues doing such great work. So I have a list of questions to pose to you, and you can just popcorn with your responses. You don't have to answer every question if you don't want to, just like have fun with it, and welcome to talk to one another as well. So the first question that I have for you is we bill ourselves as a critical sexuality studies program. So I'm curious, how has critical sexuality studies informed the work that you're doing now, and how you maybe think about critical sexuality studies in your work?
Happy to jump in again.
Great.
uh, I think that something that is really unique about the critical piece is that it's prepared me for what I see as a broader shift in. I think a lot of academia. I'm a social worker by training, but in the broader sense, in interdisciplinary work. So I'm in a college of health professions and human services, and we do a lot of interdisciplinary dialogue. But I think we have limited tools to think interdisciplinarily. And I think that the critical sexuality studies piece has really helped me. It's been a bit of a learning curve, kind of for me articulating that skill to other people, because it's something that I think coming out of this program became kind of a first language for me. But to be able to help other people, bring other people along, but that's been really helpful in um, in my teaching. Certainly I think with my students it's really helpful, a helpful framework for critical social work practice. I'm a feminist social worker, so in a lot of ways this was kind of an extension of that for me. But I think more broadly it's really helped me to kind of be at the forefront of some of these conversations. How do we teach specifically graduate students, prepare them for interdisciplinary health professions work?
So I think for me, it would be totally different from the other panelists, all of them being instructors at university. So mine becomes more of a piece of programmatic structure as we look. Though I'm the CEO of a community health center, what we do in my health center is where we do sexual health, and so we're really looking at how does all of that incorporate into an individual's sexual practices. And so probably my study has helped me more so of understanding the development of programs and how do we structure those programs and how do we connect those programs in thinking of the patient and or the client, what are their lived experiences? And so when we couple that together with the development of the program, our structure becomes something that is not just in one place that we're looking um, through just one linear place. We think broadly, and it allows us to really match or meet them in a better place and space than otherwise we would not have by not having me in this program and understanding the study and what that structure could look like.
Do you have like an example like of someone and to just like maybe that you could speak to like how you think about them navigating the structure and anything come to
So,
mind?
what we look at programmatically, we don't look at just the patient and the
Hmm.
need. We look at the patient, their need, as well as we're looking at beyond their need. So, we don't just do the sexual health piece. We also are looking at now how do we couple that in with their housing crisis? How do
Mm.
we then couple that into their nutrition and their insecurities there? And so, how do we use all those pieces coming together, develop a program and structure that program that sort of not doesn't check the box but meet their needs? Um, Along with what we also do, and I'm pulled often into research studies with local universities. And even so much so, we're doing some work with Yale in the development of some different interventions. So that's been very helpful for us.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you,
I
Dr.
like to
Jones.
jump in to kind of combine both of Bernard's and Jacinta's experiences because I'm in both of those realms. So I would say for critical sexuality studies, the main thing that I've taken away from my time there was the concept of intersectionality that I learned in the first semester. And so that really, I take that into every aspect of my work. So when I'm dealing with a patient who may be having recurrent STIs, instead of just, counseling them on the the broad things of risk reduction every time, I start to consider different aspects of their needs. Some of the things that Bernard was talking about. So, like considering their relationship dynamics or their economic situation, or if they have regular access to healthcare, that all can impact their sexual health outcomes. And then the way that I use that in the classroom is like I'll have students analyze case studies from different scenarios, real life scenarios that, of course, I've taken the names out of. And then I've asked these students, how does this person's housing affect how they can negotiate maybe safer sex practices, or how may relationship power dynamics affect how they can negotiate safer sex practices? So I usually do that when I'm discussing like STI prevention. And then when it comes to research, I kind of use intersectionality to think about more comprehensive questions for me to ask participants in my research study. So beyond just asking like, do you have access to healthcare? I might ask them about like, do you have support, or do you have community support? Do you have a flexible work schedule? So just all intersectionality just influences everything that I do.
Yeah, taking into account all the intersecting aspects of somebody as they navigate these complex systems. And yeah, great.
So similar to Andrea, right? Like critical sexuality studies has affirmed my belief and the way that I see sexuality. It has shaped it obviously with an academic lens, right? Like understanding how the sex is political, sex is activism, sex is all of these things, and so to go in line with the intersectionality, right? Like how can I teach, let's say in my position as a supervisor for other sex therapists, how can I teach from an intersectional lens that takes into account critical sexuality studies to challenge them beyond what they know? Right? Because sometimes I believe like sometimes sex therapy, not all sex therapists have the same background. And so it is really important to start seeing it from the critical sexuality lens, because it brings another layer that is extremely important. And if we forget to ask those critical questions about sexuality, then we're missing out on a lot of information that could potentially help patients, clients, and all the people that we work with, and even students. So definitely has affirmed everything that I knew as a human being, and then just implemented it in a different way and backed it up with knowledge.
Can I add just one more thing, Erin?
Absolutely.
I was just at the CIIS annual conference last week, and I think it's really interesting. I do some work with them. For anyone not familiar, they've just rewritten their mission and vision, and it's very much aligned with this critical sexuality studies, which is a really, in my view, sharp departure from a historic kind of separate biological, right? We have our doctors over here. We have our infectious disease researchers over here. And then as critical folks, we were kind of like, shouldn't you be at like a women's and gender studies conference? But this intersectionality piece that folks are speaking to now has really been integrated into the mission and vision of one of the largest interdisciplinary organizations in our field, which I think is really significant, and a place that this program was ahead of the game in some ways.
Wow, that's really great to hear. Yeah. What kinds of, if you can, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what were some of the elements of the rewrite that kind of stood out to you? Like taking into account like power dynamics and identity locations and things like that, meaning making, even if we're talking about the realm of biology, or is there something?
Yeah, it's really short, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's
Sure.
really sweet. But at the core is this idea of an intersectional power analysis, essentially, which I think is really different. And there was certainly some shakeups within the organization that precipitated this. But I think for me personally, it's been helpful to have this critical framework to understand why this shift is important. And the process of rewriting this. So it has been rewritten, but it's open for workshopping, and the way that the organization is bringing in membership in that process, I think, is a really, really different way of working that is more aligned with critical work and with participatory action work, that is very different from that strict. I mean, my training was the biopsychosocial. Now we do biopsychosocial spiritual, but I think bringing in this critical framework, understanding the different kinds of structural barriers that people face in terms of access to care that folks have mentioned, and just how people identify themselves and their sexuality in relation to other facets of their identity, how that impacts the work that we do with people, and the historic erasure of a lot of kinds of experience.
Mhm.
But when we think of this, even beyond our structure of our program, it's just a person's life. It's not just the fact of we're male, female, or whatever the gender is. We're so many other things. And so if our program did not invite those other things in, I think we would be remiss to even be able to deal with our patients and or our clients or whoever we come in contact with, because it would be just one lane in which we would be in, and that is far beyond what we are as a people.
Well, just segueing off of that, speaking of like some of these like historical erasures and where the field is going, I'm curious what challenges or barriers you're still facing as you've gone out, left this program, and gone to implement maybe changes in the realm of sexuality-related topics. Have you faced any barriers? If so, what are they, and how again, how has this informed how you approach those problems?
I think for me, some of the barriers I face is getting people on board to understand this, that don't have this kind of background. So for me, I find a lot of barriers in the clinic setting, unfortunately, at the health department. So, like for a long time, we didn't. Going back to like your identity locations, we didn't capture people's gender identity on their electronic health records. So that would sometimes make for uncomfortable situations. um, we still are struggling with how to input persons' preferred names in their clinical chart. And some of that comes with dealing with administration. And I'm telling them, hey, we need to do this. And it just kind of takes them a long time because then they're like, oh, well, we don't think the front desk staff would feel comfortable asking people what their gender identity is or what their preferred name is. And so it's like, well, we can train them. And they're like, okay, well, you do that. And I'm like, okay, I'll find the time somewhere. I don't know when, but maybe. So it's just really kind of hard getting people on board with some of the aspects. And then also just me personally with patients, we have a certain time that we can spend with them. And so sometimes that 15, 20 minutes is really not enough to kind of fully explore all the societal dynamics that could be influencing how they're experiencing health. So those are the barriers that I face in my work.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's
It's all my
similar.
work. Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, Bernard.
you're fine.
I was just gonna say it's a similar thing for me. It's the questioning. Why do you have to use this critical lens into sexuality? Why do you have to ask these questions if the problem is, just thinking of sex therapy, right? Sex therapy, this is the problem, right? So focus on the problem, let's fix it. And well, but you're not taking the human being into account and all their experiences or their intersectional experiences. So the challenge for me has been to get supervisees on board. I think with clients, it's easier because they come to you, so they know already like which framework you work from. But with supervisees, they challenge the thought of why do I need to ask that if this is what I need to help them with, if this is what they need to fix. So it's an over focusing on the function, the body function maybe, as opposed to taking into consideration what's happening in their neighborhood and what's happening in their childhood, what happened in their childhood, but how does that overlap with the space that they occupy right now.
So I think part of the challenge that I faced, included some of the things that Dr. Lewis brought up, but I'm going to I'm going to also use the business side of me on this. Um, there's also the financial parts. And part of that becomes, as we look at funding cycles and funding opportunities and some of this work, those things are not as plentiful, which is why we have to then go back to our first question and bring in some of those pieces so that we bring those interdisciplinary pieces into it. We have to mix a bowl of a lot of things to make the funding, to make the opportunity or proposal more viable for some of our funders. Then dovetails over into the space of our political arena. Um, I think there is some fear to what this is now is going to look like even more for us as a country or in our political space as we deal with this very issue and very challenge, as we also look at some of our identity, which brings up the identity politics and some of those challenges and some of those things. So we're already having to face some of those things and have just because of some things that we can't say in our proposals and some things that we can't say in our reports from some of our funders. So,
Do you have an example? I'm also curious if you have an example of things that you can't say that you feel if you said them, you wouldn't get funding because they're too
well,
controversial or
yeah. So one of our funding opportunities was actually, funny enough, dealing with race, ethnicity, um, and one of the things that we had to stop doing was we could not, which is funny enough that this was one of the things we had to stop. Any reports we wrote could not highlight race and ethnicity. And I was like, this is the craziest thing. This is exactly what this funding is for. But we could not highlight that. We could not report that to the CDC because we were told we had to stop.
I would just add, I think I'm maybe from a different geographic location. Things are a little bit different where I am, um, in that there's very much an interest in bringing this in, but right back to the limitation on funding and time. So getting this information, incorporating this, especially into clinical care, is time consuming, and I think it's really um, challenging to figure out what we need to prioritize. And I think that we have um, even some funding sources that understand the importance of this, but say, well, we have a finite number of resources, so we have to pick. You have to pick the one thing, and I think that that's I'm in HSI. Most of my students are first generation students, and there's a real understanding of the importance of critical theories in general because it speaks to people's lived experiences, but also their lived experiences. I'm a single mother and I'm trying to get a degree so that I can get a pay bump at work so that I can kind of get out of my current situation. And it's really lovely to know all of this, but I don't have the extra time to do a dissertation essentially on this. So I think that that's really challenging. And I also do some of my research collaborators are in South and Central Florida, and I think so. I have some awareness of what's going on, but I think there's real tension between the federal agenda at present. We'll see what changes, and some of these local agendas, and so. At NIH in particular, there's been a shift in understanding and in incorporating gender identity specifically and redefining how we identify or how we even classify gender identity and distinguish that from biologic sex. And that progress has happened, but I think it's been slow on the uptake. And then the other big piece as a researcher is that the many of the studies that get funded still are quantitative studies. And when we talk about bringing in an intersectionality, I just did a study, and when we really boil down the richness of people's identities, we have no statistical significance. We can't generalize anything, and that's kind of the point. But it's something that then the federal funding dollars in particular will say, well, so this is not worth our money because we don't we don't want a pet project that applies to N of one. We need to help address a larger problem. So I think that's been a challenge in terms of translating how we can not necessarily generalize qualitative findings, but how the richness of qualitative findings can inform the kind of broader scale, especially clinical work that we do.
Yeah, that old qualitative divide that's still vexing, and still the power of the number to really drive funding of projects seems alive and well. Um, so my next question, I feel like folks have already spoken to it, so I'm going to broaden it a little bit. So the next question is, how has your experience in the PhD program in particular shaped how you think about the practice of clinical work or health related work? I'm wondering if I could expand that out to invite you to speak a little bit about um, your own dissertation work and the specifics of your research, and maybe how that has informed how you're doing the work that you're doing now, if you want to make a link there. But you can also go to the original question too, so no pressure.
So continuing that qualitative, quantitative thread.
I'm still having PTSD in that space.
I'm sorry,
I
Dr.
can see the
Dean.
looks on people's faces. Maybe because I have the most distance from this, it's easier for me to speak to this. But my dissertation work was qualitative, and I think that it's been interesting to me as I've presented those findings at various conferences within my own university, the traction that it has, because it speaks people's lived experience, because it comes from the participants' lived experience. And it's definitely informed the work that I'm doing now. I have been my most recent kind of iteration of the project was on a broader scale, measuring psychological flexibility amongst LGBTQ plus people who use multiple identities over time and place. The findings there are not the most interesting or significant. Maybe that's my bias as a qualitative researcher first. But I would say that having had the opportunity to do my own work and qualitative work that spoke to my experience as a clinician and what I was seeing firsthand, as opposed to going into somebody else's lab and kind of replicating existing studies, has been really, really helpful in that I am now a junior faculty member, but I feel I'm much more able to stand on my own 2 feet, because I know my work inside and out. And the I think that it's informed this next step, this quantitative step, this kind of looking at federal dollars to understand why people psychologically adhere to things like PrEP and other kinds of HIV prevention measures. I think I have learned to speak that language after the fact, but had I not had the critical foundation, that my work to me personally would probably feel pretty like empty, like kind of a replication of what exists, as opposed to something really connected to the lived experiences of people that I work with.
Could you maybe, thank you so much. Could you maybe give an example when you say multiple identities shifting over time, and just give an example from your work and how you were thinking about that in relation to what you're doing?
Sure, going all the way back into the dissertation.
Yeah, right.
That's actually, so that's why I'm here in Spain. I'm presenting some of the findings of my newer
Oh, cool.
research that follows this line. So my original study, my dissertation study, was interviewing people in New York City area, millennials who used multiple identity labels, meaning like sometimes they identified as gay, sometimes they identified as queer, sometimes they identified as pan, sometimes none of your business. Um, Obviously challenging to capture in terms of recruitment. How do you get people that are using these different labels and maybe not consciously aware of this shifting, or wouldn't identify themselves as shifting? So that was a whole thing. But it came from my work in New York City and in Philadelphia, working with folks who were adolescents and young adults at the time who I was seeing in practice who were using different labels just in conversation and in the clinical work that we were doing together, just kind of casually. The existing models that we had of sexual identity development are pretty linear, pretty staged, very Ericksonian. So in that framework, these folks are undergoing some sort of identity confusion. They should have worse health outcomes. They should not be able to kind of develop social networks because of their unclear identities. But that wasn't what I was seeing. So the original study came from, okay, what's this disparity? How are people coming to engage with these labels, and how does it kind of foster, facilitate well-being or not? And the broad strokes are that people are doing this strategically, right? And that we all kind of intuitively do this. It's just that when we drill down on sexuality, we have unintentionally, I think, pathologized queer folks, non-cis het folks for navigating this in very pro-social ways, right? So, as an example, a participant would describe, I to my friends, I'm pansexual. When I'm trying to hook up, I am kinky because I'm interested in having a particular kind of sex. And when I talk to my mom, I tell her I'm gay because she doesn't understand anything else. Right. So nothing kind of confused or pathological about that, but really context specific use of identity labels. So that's what I mean when I say people who use different identity labels.
Great.
As opposed to
Thank you
like
so
Lisa
much.
Diamond's work, where people are kind of identifying as uh, bisexual and then lesbian and then bisexual and kind of
Mhm, mhm.
very specific to the romantic relationship. This was specific, like I guess more general to a variety of contexts.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I'll hold them. So great to hear about more in depth about your work.
I can go. So my dissertation was on how Black women's rap music influences Black women's sexuality, especially in terms of their pleasure and power and financial empowerment. It was a qualitative study. And so what I've done from that is two things. So one is I have my students kind of do the same project. So I teach human sexuality for undergraduate students, and so their final project is always to analyze music and a specific theme related to human sexuality. So that kind of keeps me up to date on all the different songs, and it's also interesting how they relate that and their perspectives from their music and what they choose as their topics. And then building on that study, I now am doing two research projects really. One is looking at the medical gender racism of Black women's experiences with pelvic pain disorder. And then also looking at the sexual and reproductive needs of young Black women in Greensboro. Yes, shout out. Thank you, Dr. Azim. So how does that influence my work? So again, intersectionality, looking at these young Black women and the things that they have gone through, their upbringing. So when I'm interviewing them or when we did the focus group and hearing their stories, I'm just thinking back to I'm just thinking of the social systems and the political systems and the power that are coming through their stories. And when they tell me about their experiences, maybe with sexual trauma, which was a surprising finding that we found in all of our focus groups, that these young Black women were talking about sexual trauma and how they haven't really found a space to deal with that. So we'll be actually doing an intervention in the spring. So that also brings you to the point that like when you're going into research and you're thinking you're going to find something, like what you get from your participants can like definitely change what you think you're going to do. Because we were planning on doing an intervention like, oh, they probably need education about STIs. And like, that's not what they need. They actually were all okay about that. They needed to know how to deal with their sexual trauma and how to heal from that. So that's important.
I can speak of my work as well. It's qualitative, and it was a narrative-based study. I interview Peruvian immigrant women who live in the United States, and the to understand what their concept and their conceptualization of sexual citizenship was. And so I remember sitting in Dr. Marzulo's class, and she brought up the theme of sexual citizenship, and I was like, oh, hold on, what is this, right? And so it hit. As an immigrant and changing geographical locations, there's a lot of changes that happen, obviously, and so I started to think, okay, what do I want to, what is the population that I'm interested? The majority of the people that I work with are Latinx clients. And so I definitely wanted to do it with one of the populations that I work with. So I decided, why not do it with Peruvians? Right. And so what I did was analyze specific time frame in Peru, in sociopolitically, what was happening in Peru, and how it impacted the ways that they perceived their sexual citizenship back in Peru through their migration process and after their migration process and after a few years of settling in their lives in the United States or anywhere else, wherever they were. So understanding that provided me with a glimpse into the different shifts that they had gone through with their sexuality. And of course, there were different themes. And across all of the women that I've interviewed, sexual violence, sexual trauma was a thing that came up. And it was one of the factors of how they felt about their sexual citizenship when they were in the United States. So afterwards. So whatever they had experienced impacted the way that they perceived whether it was more safe or less safe. It just depended on where they lived also now in the United States. And so I also incorporated, so there was there's a lot of Peruvian history that goes into there's a lot of Peruvian history that goes into the study that I did, political history specifically, and the introduction of neoliberalism into the Peruvian reality and what it created, what gender changes did it create. And then I use also Bembe's necropolitics lens to really understand how Peruvian women navigate their sexuality in Peru, and how even as an example, even like them being forced sterilized, women in the Andes were forced sterilized back in the 90s, and still have they're still fighting for their rights to be acknowledged, for that to be acknowledged by the government. How all of that has influenced the women that are here, the women that have migrated, and the reasons why they migrated. And most of them also had to do, there were intersections of they did move because of the way that they felt and the way that they moved as women in Peruvian society.
And so so the sexual citizenship part, so the women felt like they were devalued vis-a-vis their sexuality in Peru, and that was one of the reasons that they were seeking a context in which their sexuality would be at least not as devalued. Is that
Yeah, so they had the opportunity, right? Some of them had opportunity to migrate, whether it was for work, see a different reality, and that's when they saw, oh, okay, I can experience my sexual citizenship differently. The biggest example that I'm always remembering is I can wear shorts now. I can walk around the street and wear shorts, versus in Peru specifically. It depends where you are, but if I wear shorts, right, like people will catcall me and people will harass me and people will talk about, right? So then what does it mean to be that person here after I understand what my sexual citizenship is? If I know, if I understand my sexual citizenship.
Thank you so much.
Wow. Okay. I guess you guys are wanting to know all the good stuff mine did. So I was looking at the Black church and development of masculinity in Black men who have sex with men as a riskscape in the era of PrEP and HIV. And so what I was really looking at gathering was how did the Black church inform these individuals of masculinity. How do they come to develop and understand their concepts of masculinity? And in that, how that facilitated the conclusions that they came up with that as well. And then what was the information and those things that could cause the concept of risk in their behavior or challenge of behavior and in their lives and when it comes to HIV and PrEP. And so the interesting concepts of the or thoughts of finding out is how these participants actually viewed church. Um, and that view was a very different thought from a different conclusion from what I thought. Because historically, looking at the Black church and the structure of the Black church, um, participants now show that they really don't subscribe to that of the historical thoughts of Black church. And their view of masculinity comes from varied lenses um, by way of teaching and understanding of it could be through the lens of their mother or even their father. But none of that really lended to the church because of their disbelief of the concepts of church, which is a very interesting thought of that, as well as um, many did not subscribe or think to the thought of their sexual behaviors were risk. Um, and so indeed that they did not even in the surveys, many didn't find themselves wanting to share whether they were on PrEP or whether they were taking HIV meds or things of that sort, or having a test for HIV. So that was just very interesting seeing some of those thoughts. And I'm doing this from the umbrella of the South. So that then brings in another caveat as we talk about stigma and some of those things. And so that barrier of stigma also, I think, played into some of why the answers to those questions came the way they did. So where I am now with the study is I have not presented, I haven't unpacked it to be able to go even try to do anything else. Like I said, I'm still at the PTSD phase. So, but what has happened is that I'm now wanting to dig more into the religious part of it. So thinking of doing some work or doing some more education in the space of theology to want to dig a little bit more with my research and dig a little more and see how we move forward with that.
I do
It
want to
takes a little
say,
while.
yeah, Bernard, it does take a
6
while.
months or so.
Yeah, to get through that PTSD, but hopefully you'll get through it. As I shared with Erin too, I got through mine, and I was actually lucky to get an article published on one of my findings
Yeah.
from my dissertation. And so I have another one that's a revise and resubmit. So hopefully that will get funded too. Well, published too, sorry.
Good.
Yeah,
So
it'll get there.
I'm at the point of a year having defended. Wonderful. However, I was just recently I was asked to do a chapter, and so I was really going to do this chapter on using the parts of my dissertation, but I had to go back and just say at this time I can't do that, and it's not totally due to the PTSD. Some of it is also just my life is just a little crazy right now, along with that. So yeah, and I really wanted to, but I was like I can't really give the attention because there's so much that's going on. But yeah.
It takes time. You're good. I think we all remember. Yeah.
Well, and it's funny how you guys say it takes time. It's sort of like a whisper. It takes time.
It takes time. Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll get through it. So I'm curious if you have any specific hopes for the future of sexuality studies that you'd like to share, whether that's in relation to your own work or just where you think the field is going, next, or where you think it should go next. Anything that comes to mind.
For me, I have to say this. I want to see more in the future. My hope is that I see more and more Black men in this space. And I think that's very important because there's so much work to be done when it comes to Black men, sexuality, masculinity, and the whole concepts of that and informationally. I too was at Quad-S last week, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to see each other and talk, Jacinta. But it was challenging, and I find myself in some of these spaces and places. It's challenging and disheartening to me that I don't get to see those brothers who look like me in this space and finding this work necessary. Or even, and part of that may even be the fact that they don't know what's available and opportunities to them, as well as some of the studies and information and research needs to be done by some of these same individuals, because it is a time that this needs to be really rolled out and all the masses need to hear what that's like and what's going on in these spaces and far beyond the HIV and the STIs, because I see that so often. But Black men are more than just that.
I would add to that. I think that, yes, we need to bring more people in, and then we need those diverse perspectives out. So I think if we can diversify within and then have folks in other areas, I think of myself sometimes as like an ambassador in social work. I think it's really important that we bring the work that we do into other areas, professionally, because it's needed, it's necessary, and especially in the American context, it's so taboo, but it's always right there. But I think that, yes, Dr. Davis is absolutely 100% on the money there. We need to bring more folks in, and I think question ourselves, right? There's been some self-critique about like queer theory in particular being a pretty white space, and I think that we need to examine how do we bring in, and even looking at programmatically, I think that, you know, we've, with hybrid programs, tried to bring in more people, but looking at how do we fund folks who can't afford this to do this work, so that we can bring in a diversity of voices that are then doing work. I think that's the key, is that if we bring in folks that do work that makes sense to them, then they can make sense in their own communities. And as opposed to having kind of, I'll pick on social work, the model of the white lady coming into the community and kind of wagging a finger and saying, this is what you need.
So to piggyback on that one, I also believe that, like, you know, as therapists, we have this space of access to not only other clinicians who might not be sexuality professionals, but also to people who are training to be sexuality professionals. And so we have, my hope, I guess, would be that we are able to, or that people actually can see the importance of critical sexuality studies into the work that they do, that if not, they're missing an essential component of everything, of human existence. And if we're not doing that, then how can we, as agents of change, bring it into those spaces? How do we do this? And also talking about, like, the creation of knowledge would be, you know, what are the things that we need from the global south into the global north? What kind of exchanges do we need to have? What kind of conversations do we need to have about critical sexuality studies across nations, across the globe, right? What is the information that we need to hear from other places? And I think that that's what I connected in my dissertation. I used a lot of information from the global south, but I understand and I know that not a lot of knowledge is being published there when it comes to critical sexuality studies. Most of the stuff comes from the space of where the money is. And so, yes, it is harder to get that information, but also acknowledging there's so many studies across the globe that could be implemented into, and I think it was your class, Aaron, that you had global sexuality studies, where you implemented like different articles from different places, right? So knowledge from other places to be incorporated also into critical sexuality studies.
And I'm just gonna hop on that back too, and say, yeah, seeing more representation, especially from minority groups or underrepresented groups. As a clinician, as a PA, not only being that there's only out of all PAs, only 3% are Black individuals, and then when we think about holding doctoral degrees, only 2% of women or Black women hold doctoral degrees. So, um, I think that definitely influences the type of care that people receive, the type of knowledge that is out there as well. And in addition to like all the knowledge that we're bringing to the field, all this theoretical knowledge, I really hope to see it in practice. So, like for example, I write about sexual pleasure, right? But like, and it's in the academia now. It's published. But how do regular young Black women on the street? How does she get to know this? And so that's what I hope to bring to my classes. Like when we talk about pleasure, so that they can have that. But again, I'm still reaching a certain subset, right? People who can afford to go to college or who have that experience.
Right.
So it's really it's hard, and that's one of the challenges too. Is how do we get this to someone who's not in academics or who may not be exposed to our work through articles. So, yeah.
Right, right. And I love that you were like in this opportunity to use music to do that, to
Mhm.
like kind of think about the representations um within music, different musical forms and genres, and get people really excited about thinking more about sexuality in that way. It's just really, really cool. Um, Great. So we'll go to the open it up soon to questions, but maybe time for one more and then a short one about like how people can learn more about your work. But just curious, looking back, is there any advice that you wish you had during your training that you might offer now, whether to graduate students or people thinking about going into the fields that you all work in? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think that we read so much in the PhD program that sometimes we're just going through the motions.
Mm,
And it is okay, because when you're gonna need to remember the thing that you read somewhere, you'll go find it. So I understand that, that we might not just retain all the information that we were presented, but I know that I went back and I looked for the things that really stood out
right.
to me that I needed in my dissertation. So feeling overwhelmed is okay, but also know that you're going to come back and use and find the thing that you need.
Because at least you know now that's a thing that you can find. Right.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So probably as advice, I would probably give, and it's probably kind of interesting. So one of the things, and I'll say this, Dr. Tellerick and myself were sort of different from our cohort. We were in the first cohort. And our difference was that we also already had some experiences in the university setting of human sexuality because we were former students of Widener. And so one of the things, and so bringing that, it was like we knew a little something, or especially me, a little something. But I wish someone had said to me in knowing or having an idea of what I wanted to write my dissertation on was to sort of at laying in that space of everything that you are going to be writing about during your classes up until even through all of um, all the other classes you're going to have. If you keep it in the space or the thought of what you're going to do your dissertation on, it would be helpful for you when it comes to all of the references, all the things that you're going to need when you get to the end of all of this in writing your dissertation. I think it would be very helpful to be able to sort of have that. But of course, you also know that there are also times that you'll be in a class and something else speaks to you that you may even decide to make a change. But if you have a great idea, that would be a helpful piece for you.
Like always putting that your interest at the center whenever you're writing your papers, whenever you're reading, just kind of keep like looking at it from this angle and then that angle. And yeah, that's great. It's great. Any other
I think
thoughts on this question?
for me, it would have been helpful to know from the outset that you're going to leave this program like you've left every other training program, not knowing, and kind of recognizing more of what you don't know than what you do know, which I think after spending the better part of a decade doing work can be a little shocking and unsettling. And for me, it's been only in hindsight that I recognize that like this is a part of my life's work. Not that this is the one thing that I'm going to do forever, but this is something that I'm so passionate about that it connects to so much that matters to me, and that is an important driving force because there is no finish line. You're always going to benefit from more training in terms of methodology, and just the knowledge continues to change at that, and the importance of community. So I am confident that I would not have finished this program had it not been for Dr. Davis and some of my cohort mates and people in my life personally. And I think that also um, was a shift for me to kind of depend on other people uh, through this process, and to lean into community, even though I'm a first generation academic in my family. Nobody has any idea what the heck I'm doing or why, but to have to find who your people are so that they can support you regardless. But it's also very, very helpful to have the folks in your cohort because they do get it. It's the experience of becoming, I mean, to do a dissertation, you've now become an expert in something that no one else is an expert in. So you're an alien, you're an island. that's a really, really psychologically challenging experience. But to have some other people who parallel that, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like you become the expert in that one thing, and the whole point of the dissertation is that no one else has done this specific thing before. So you really are just like the metaphor of the island. You really are a kind of island, and yet other people have gone through that process as well with respect to their own little niche thing that they're so passionate about. So you can get support from those people. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think that's great. So it seems like Bernard and Jacinta, y'all were in the same cohort together. Is that correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, and Stephanie were in the same cohort together as well.
Oh, yeah.
So
Mhm.
there is community there. My advice is for people to seek out opportunities to build the theory into practice. I think I wish I would have learned more ways that we could do that, or how to do that, linking that bridge between theory and practice. So if there's more opportunities for that to happen, that'd be great.
Thank you all. Well, before we kick it open to questions from the audience, I want to just invite each of you, is there a way for the audience to, if they want to learn more about you or your work, if you want to share like a link to your website or to your organization, um, please do so if you want to say anything about that. Um, yeah, how can people learn more about you or your work if they're interested?
Anything short of
Um,
calling me.
You can just find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'm not fancy enough yet for a website, but I'll get there one day maybe.
Yeah.
You could. Oh,
LinkedIn, my practice website is drtalarico.com, and then my university is Kane University, which looks like Keene. It's the Kane family, New Jersey, so KEAN .edu. I'm in there somewhere.
so similar website, Dr. Simich Munoz, both of my last names, .com, or Instagram. I have an Instagram page that I'm very active on, or LinkedIn.
Great.
So again, as everyone else, LinkedIn, and my organization's website is RAO, raoassist.org.
Okay. So if anyone wants to throw that into the chat, please feel free. If you want to, like, if anyone wants to reach out to you, if that's an open, if you're open to that, please feel free. Well, thank you so much. I want to just turn it over now to members of the audience to ask any questions that might be percolating for all of you. Anything that's coming up that sparked your interest that you want to know more about?
I have a question for Bernard. Hi, I'm Leanne. I'm the program manager for HSX. And I really loved what you were saying about how you wish that you saw more Black men in the field. And I'm wondering if there were more Black men in sexuality studies, in sexuality related fields, what would change about the field and the practices?
So thank you for the question. So I think what the change would be is that we wouldn't see as many others writing the script for us. And what I mean by that is so oftentimes, even now, research that I'm involved in, or even that I'm asked to be involved in, the principal on that research does not look like me. Which is oftentimes why I'm being asked to either be a co on it, and or why I am asked to be a part of the development and implementation piece because you don't have the lived experience. So I think what you would see is more individuals being able to give a lived experience as well as research that would be geared towards them that would, for me, often be more palatable, as well as if you look at masculinity studies, that lens was not, or that theory was not rooted and grounded in, or that lens was more of non-Black individuals in the development of that. That lens was not, it was really a white man's lens. And so that becomes a little challenging sometimes when you're doing that research.
Thanks for that question, Leanne. Other questions? You can also put them in the chat. You can, if you're shy, you can direct it to me and I can read your question, whatever feels good. I had a follow-up question, Dr. Simich Munoz. I was curious if you're continuing to work with women who have immigrated to the U.S. Around just like notions of sexual citizenship, and I'm curious, especially given some of the backslide in the United States vis-a-vis reproductive rights, even since you defended your dissertation, some pretty big, overturning of Roe v. Wade and so on and so forth. So just anything that popping up there in terms of, oh, this isn't what I bargained for, or this isn't what I hoped it would be. I'm just curious.
Yes. I continue to work with immigrant women. That's the majority of the people that I work with in clinical practice. I'm writing the sexual citizenship book to bring it from, and I think Andrea was alluding to this, like from theory into like the practice of how, like clinical practice. So that's my ongoing work, right? And so I hope to continue doing research on sexual citizenship with different women from different geographical locations. That is my hope. I'm still looking for the place to do that in. And so when that opportunity comes up, yes, I'm gonna be doing research with a lot of the women that I see are from the Central America area. So definitely Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Those are the women that I want to ask them about their sexual citizenship, because I know that having a qualitative research for dissertation, right, it has a limited amount of people that I got for the research itself. So I hope to have a broader perspective and different women. So I continue to work with sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual trauma, human trafficking, sex trafficking. All of those things are still at the core of everything I do.
Oh, thank you. Other questions for our panelists?
Sorry. I just wanted to thank everyone because this was so interesting. I'm Mirena Kay. I'm actually one of Dr. Lewis's colleagues or ex-colleagues. But I find this work really interesting because I'm also a clinician that works in public health and does a lot of sexual health. And one thing that I struggle with a lot is like self-care and while doing this really difficult work, and being able to remember to like hold space for myself. So I didn't know if anybody could share maybe just like a couple things that y'all do for yourself to be able to stay grounded in this work, to be able to get up and keep doing it every day, especially in the current climate.
Oh, so I'll start sharing. One of the things that I made myself start doing was taking time off. I literally take at least a week off once a quarter. I need a break. And the other thing that I do for myself is I get a massage often because I am so tense from just having, you get tired and you get worn down yourself. And so if you yourself are not reinvesting in yourself, you will burn out. And so those are things that I do.
I have an extensive menu. I feel like I'm at an advantage. Social work, we actually incorporated self-care into our code of ethics as a way to kind of help folks advocate for themselves in workplaces that are really, really taxing and toxic. But I think one of the cool things for me as an instructor now, I have students in their first year, they develop a self-care activity and they bring it to the class. So now I have like all different options from my students. But I'll say that for me, I feel really fortunate that I was able to kind of rediscover the importance of ritual and like normal cultural practices for me. So regular meals with people that I love and care about is like one of the most life sustaining things. Regular walks, exercise, and not as like a checkbox. I'm doing this intense class as my self care, but like as a part of my um, daily practice. Walking, I think of it as like running meditation. Um, and yeah, I don't time off, yes, but for me, if I'm not doing several things every day, then I will burn out. So I incorporate all of this into every day because I've learned that one the hard way, I guess I can say.
As an energy worker, I do a lot of energy healing. So whether that is going to see my acupuncturist or just ground myself in nature, barefooted, like, and just standing there and connecting to nature, to Pachamama, and asking to release some of that tension, some of that stress from the body. So I do a lot of that. And so intentional time. Fridays are my days off. I work 4 days a week, but sometimes I write on the weekends or do something on the weekends, but I do intentional time of massages and things like that as well.
Taking notes. Anyone else? Dr. Lewis.
Yeah, I have other goals like outside of the work that I do, that that I, try and incorporate in. So learning Spanish is one of those. Also traveling. So luckily as an instructor, we get, or for me, I get my summers off. So I take that time to go and travel and do things that I want to do. Also community, having girlfriends, going out to eat and dance with them. So enjoying time like that.
Any other questions? Leanne, did you have a question?
I
I
do
saw
have
you
another
unmute.
question.
Okay.
Yes. And this question is for all of the speakers. You are already change makers in the sense that you're used to pushing boundaries of what currently exists. Given this political climate, and we're about to see a lot of shifts, um, do you think that we have a responsibility to meet this moment in a particular way? And if so, what does that responsibility look like?
To me, it's not to stay like to be loud, not to stay quiet, to be able to talk about the things, to hold space for others, obviously, as a therapist or a supervisor, to hold space for students as well, but not to stay quiet and to continue doing the work. And with that self-care piece that I was talking about of energy healing, elevating vibration, elevating energy to make sure that we are held and that we can continue doing this work.
I would agree with that. I think that also, um, I think it's important for us as we become elders in the field, um, to stay optimistic and I see with my younger students, they can kind of throw up their hands and, oh, we're only backsliding. But I think, I think back to reading Gil Hurt's Sex Panics, Moral Panics, and I think in moments like this, it's really helpful and instructive to have the broader arc of history, and to, yes, be loud, be direct, not to sugarcoat the realities, um, and not to be Pollyannish in our optimism, but to, be optimistic in a way that sustains people. Um, because I think that there's no way out of this. If we can opt out, then that's an immense amount of privilege. I think that our um, our duty in this work is to, if we have that option, to stay in, for those that don't, and in that to be really, I guess, looking backwards and forwards at the same time. I think of like Sankofa practice, right?
So much for that question. Are there any other questions? We have about 10 more minutes if folks want to continue the conversation. And sorry if I cut off any of our speakers who wanted to respond as well. I had another question, which I thought was interesting from our last discussion with some of our current graduates. And I was curious if this prompts any thought, like, um, do people have, when you tell people that you work in the area of sexuality studies, oh, I see someone's hand, I'll come circle back. I'm curious if people have misconceptions or common misconceptions about your topic area, and if there's a specific correction that your work offers to that misconception.
Yes, very much so. Um, you get all the like, ooh, like what is that about? Like, ooh, oh, you can be, what do you know all about sex and the different sex positions? And I'm like, that's not at all what I learned. Um, so I guess my counterpoint to that is telling them about critical sexuality studies and telling them I look at how society, how power dynamics, how all of these things influence how we come to know ourselves as sexual individuals and how we experience the world in terms of our sexuality and our expressions and the historical, how all of these things kind of impact how we know ourselves as sexual beings. And they're like, oh. I'm like, yeah.
The disappointment falls over their faces.
Yeah.
No, so important. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
So I think it's similar. Had the same experience, but then when I explained to them, looking at my dissertation, it really was geared towards more of being informed to then go back to the religious community and have conversation. How do we make this work for all of your congregants that no one feels alienated or isolated? So then that conversation then shifts into something totally different. So yeah.
Yeah, I think for me that's the shift. Is like the misconception is that this is a purely intellectual academic field and we're just thinking about things and not doing anything, but helping people understand how this gets applied to work that we do with folks.
Well, and as a sex therapist, that's the question, right? That's always going to come up. Are you going to be touching me? Are you going to be doing this? Are you going to be doing that? And then you explain it, obviously, of I am an academic in sexuality, and this is what I do, and this is how and so I might know some of those positions that you were talking about, but obviously, right, like this is the work that we do. It's different than what you're thinking.
Yeah.
But you bring out a very good point. I think I think that it becomes an easier way to explain as a sex therapist. Those of us who don't do the therapy part, it becomes more educational, it becomes more of program development, and it becomes more of consulting. And then there comes some more questions to that. And so then we have to show how that application of our teaching, how then that can be applied and how does that make it more applicable and teach them to understand how even sexuality, sexual education, all those things, how is that actually working in your everyday life anyway, though you may not already realize that.
Camille.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So, okay. As we learn, right, we grow and we expand our way of thinking about things. The more information we get, we start doing things differently, right? So I guess my question is like, what have you learned about yourself as you are learning about sexuality, as you are expanding in your own knowledge? What are some insights that you gained about yourself? What are just like, how were you able to make that shift? Whatever that is for you.
Oh, wow.
How much time do you have?
I know.
It's like I'm making that shift now as I'm thinking about going into this field, right? What it is that I want to study and like how, my background is in therapy and I've worked with sexual traumas and I've been honored to work in educational programs on human trafficking and then doing work to become a certified sex addiction therapist. So but I also see how I've shifted as I'm shifting into these different spaces, right? So listening to you, it's like, oh, great, another shift's going to come right when I'm doing my dissertation. Yay, me. Okay.
So I can share one of the things, some of the stuff that happened to me. So starting out, again, my background is sexual health. And so how I got actually into this work was because or going in even deciding to get a dissertation was so oftentimes as I was um, a public health advisor, I would have to listen to my patients talk about understanding their diagnosis. And one of the things that happened for me was that they kept telling me, my African American males would say, well, God's going to heal me. My non African American males never said that. And so I was grappling with the whole, and here I am, a pastor's son in the South, going to church, all these wonderful things. And what the biblical tense of was one thing, what the practical parts for some of these individuals were different. But however, though what their behavior may be or may not have been was one that did not coincide with what their biblical teachings were. And so then coming into this space and learning, I just became like, oh my God. Um, I didn't feel, I started changing, clearly language changed. Let's start there. My language changed. I then had language to be able to explain and understand certain things. I also began to not demonize people's feelings and their thoughts and their views. And so I became more sensitive to the idea of being a sexual being and in being a sexual being, what all does that entail? As well as how does the pleasure points then come in to make one understand how to love themselves in whatever state they're in. So those are some of the challenges that I had in some of the space I was in. So.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think just that you're asking the questions is um, it shows that you're aware that this will happen, and that's so much of it is just having the space and the vulnerability to be open to changing. I think with all of learning, we change, but with sexuality, it's so personal, it's so charged. I would argue that it's the most vulnerable place that we can be, and that can bring up a lot for folks. But um, I think that you're aware of it from the outset. You just have to hold space, and it's very related to that question of self-care, right? For me, self-care isn't about making sure I have a regular pedicure, but about making sure I know who I am and still am in touch with the internal world. And that stuff takes space, right? We don't know how it unfolds until it's unfolding, and it's only ever in hindsight that we can make sense of any of it. So I would just say, yeah, I'm a completely different person than I was at the beginning, but at the same time, I'm just more myself. I'm in better touch with
Mm,
myself. I'm more aware, as Bernard said, I have better language,
mhm.
which has been really helpful for me and the people in my life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Great.
agree with both. And I think that's the point of going through a PhD program or any extra schooling is that you want to change, you want to learn, you want to grow. So when I enter the program, I mean, I'm a clinician trained, so I approach things clinically, science background, facts, evidence. Um, but going through the program, I learned the language or I learned the theories of what I was observing. I was able to put terms to it. I was able to put theories behind it, of what I was seeing with my patients, in the clinical practice and how things were influenced. I was able to use things like intersectionality. I'll say again, if I didn't learn anything else from the PhD program, I learned intersectionality. I was able to be like, oh my gosh, this is what my own self was experiencing, right? I didn't have that term before I came to the program. I've never heard that term before until I came to the program. And I was like, "Oh yes, this is what I've been experiencing my whole entire life." And then able to see how that influences also my patients as well. And then just other just people as a whole. And so That's the change and shift that I'm grateful for. And so now when I argue things, with my very religious family from the South, we're from Louisiana, I have, things to back it up. I have questions to ask them to make them think outside the box. And sometimes things get lost, but it's okay because maybe I planted the bug.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that internal change, and I think that that's what everybody's saying, right? Like that understanding yourself better and understanding how to have these conversations and who to have the conversations with when the times come, right? And so it's a deeper understanding of your own sexuality as a human being, but also the sexuality of others and how we intersect. How my intersectionalities and my sexuality intersects with Andrea's, for example, and how can we relate to each other based on that, and so it's a very deep connection to self. That's what comes out, right? But bringing it from the academic into like the human experience.
Definitely. That's what I'm getting. Like my keywords are intersectionality. Okay. Okay. I even put in quantitative and qualitative, looking at things, right? Like from in and out. But all of that looks like expansion. There's so much expansion that goes on inwardly first so that it can go outwardly. So thank you. More change. Yay. But
Really
thank you
appreciate
much, all of you being here. Thank you. And sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that question, really connecting us to each of you as people. And we're at the end of our time. And I just want to thank you, each of the panelists, so much for sharing your insights, sharing your experience, what you've taken away from our program, and helping us to celebrate 10 years of hard work and 10 years of change as you go out into the world and do this work every day. So I'm really honored to be with you in community and doing this work. And thank you so much for being here.